You know how to do it? Is it okay now? Yeah. Okay, it's an enormous pleasure for me to introduce Kasia Bojarska. I think it's already almost 70 years ago that we met, because you contacted me because you wanted to translate an article, a text of me titled "Playing the Holocaust" into Polish. And of course I said yes, but that was only the beginning of a long exchange of ideas, activities, and so on. First of all, you translated many other essays and texts I wrote, and ultimately even a book, a whole book into Polish of articles which I had written. And this fact, the fact that you contacted me and that you did all these things for me in a way that was especially my interest, that you did all these things, I think is emblematic for three very important qualities of you. First of all, your generosity. Second, your brightness and intelligence. And third, your productivity. But let's first talk about your generosity. And not only because you translated my work into Polish, but you did that with the work of many individual scholars. Now, there's an endless list of texts and essays of international scholars which you translated into Polish. But that is not only a generosity to all these individual scholars, but it was also a kind of generosity to the academic and cultural life of Poland. Because you introduced many scholars, international scholars, into Polish culture and academic life, which were then not known there. So that's, I think, extremely generous of you that you did that. But you were not only generous to Polish and academic and cultural life by all these translations, but also by organizing many conferences, but also by starting all kinds of new journals, and not only Polish journals, but also which are journals which are ultimately international new journals, like VDOC, a journal for visual culture. And that's, I think Poland should be extremely grateful to you. But not only Poland, I think it's also, all your activities in Poland are now also a kind of center for international academic life. So yeah, your generosity, all the time and energy you spent into that, I think has been extremely important. But then it's not only the time and your generosity which you spend into all these translation, all these different kind of activities, it is also your own contributions to academic life and culture at large. You have published an enormous amount of articles in books, in journals, but also catalog essays in Polish as well as in English. So that is also extremely impressive, especially because you are still considered to be a young academic. When you see the list of articles and catalog essays and all you have done, you are in a way a senior academic, not a junior academic. But officially, according to your position, you are still a junior academic. And that's because your contribution to academic life and to culture at large translates into an endless list of essays about literature, about contemporary art, and also translations of other people into Polish. And that is extremely impressive. So you're not very important to Polish culture and academic life, but also to the international world and academic life. And you're really a kind of translator in all kinds of directions, and in your activities, this all comes together. One thing which I really appreciate is also in your work is that in a way we have a lot in common. And the reason why you contacted me in order to translate this text, Playing the Holocaust into Polish, has to do with the fact that it is about Holocaust memory, Holocaust culture, and that's also one of your main interests. But it's not limited to that. What we also share is your interest in cultural memory into gender studies and literature, as well as contemporary art. So in a way, it is very understandable that we have been ongoing friends for so many years. Okay, now let's just say what you're doing now. You're assistant professor at the Cultural Studies Department of the Social Science and Humanities University in Warsaw. That's what your position is now. You have had other positions also at the Polish Academy of the Sciences and Humanities, but this is where you are now, and we are expecting a lot of new publications and other activities of you. Okay, the floor is yours now, Kasia.
Oh, wow. That was a lot. Thank you so much. It's actually really been an incredible adventure for me, knowing Ernst van Alphen, but also knowing his works and knowing Dutch art and culture. And I'm very grateful to be able to share my thoughts with you here in this exceptional place, an institution devoted to entangled and layered memories of violence and their legacy in our contemporary world. I have spent the last 3.5 years researching what Ernst van Alphen called affective operations of art, this time in relation to past conflicts and their conflicting memories. Here are some thoughts which were born at the very specific present moment, where, as Griselda Pollock rightly put it, we need to be asking the following question. How will the evil unleashed by the pandemic of SARS-CoV-2 compare to the historical and political ills of our traumatically anti-messianic history of colonialism, enslavement, industrial capitalism, genocidal totalitarianism, recurrent fascisms, institutional racism, and systemic violence against women, queer, and trans people? That's a quote from Griselda Pollock's text. So the title of my presentation, Memory Practiced in Arts, How Historical Conflicts, Traumas, and Erasures Resurface. And here we go. Visual and performative arts have regularly responded to both historical and present conflicts. In the research in RePAST international project, we have followed numerous contemporary artistic practices related to troubled pasts of Poland, Germany, Spain, Cyprus, Bosnia, Kosovo, Ireland, and Greece. We have gathered works that explicitly addressed troubled pasts, responded to collective memory crisis, or specific historical political decisions concerning the shape of memory. We included cases which caused public distress, public debate about the troubled past, some of which were considered scandalous or unacceptable, and as such were rejected and even censored. As much as we have been respectful of differences and local specificities, we search for possible interconnections and transnational resonances. We have tested the idea of expanding the collective of collective memory, or the public of the public memory, allowing for imagining the memory alliances over competitions, allowing associations of events and experiences from various contexts of violence. These have been suggested to us by the artworks and interventions themselves, and encourage us to unlearn the rules and accept the boundaries of academic experimental thinking. As editors of a book entitled Essays in Migratory Aesthetics claim, and I quote from this introduction, aesthetic practices and artists are subject to multiple cultural, political, and economic constraints. And yet, aesthetic practices often gain their force precisely through their contestation of constraint and the assertion of a certain freedom of movement. Aesthetic freedom is linked to human agency, to the power to create the multicultural habitats in which we live, end of quote. Our work was inspired by the awareness that we have been witnessing historical conflicts, traumas being weaponized by conservatives and liberals alike for the ends which rarely properly address inequalities and produce solidarities in the present. So we were especially looking at these moments of ruptures whereby people and societies revise and transform their attitudes towards difficult aspects of their collective identity and address the repressions of unwelcome contents and emotions such as guilt, shame, and repulsion. My presentation is based on the conviction of the dialectical relationship between art and memory politics, or more broadly, between image production and memory production. These are not only interwoven, but more importantly, constitutive of one another. As democratic state institutions often respond inadequately or belatedly to problems related to traumatic memory or conflicting memories of troubled past, art steps in with response that is not necessarily more adequate or timely, but in its ambiguity, it opens up a space for tackling numerous problems and complications without the necessity for closure, that is, providing immediate solutions. The work on memory done by artistic interventions rests on, and I quote here, dense significations, figures and scenes that establish points of condensation and anchorage with respect to the past and forge exemplary values, which are not given once and for all, but require constant reworking and reinforcement from present, end of quote. And this quote was from Hugo Vezzetti from his Scenes from the Crisis. In most cases, when artworks and cultural artifacts have been addressed and discussed in relation to the memory of troubled pasts, traumatic events, and past conflicts, it has been in the framework of cultural memory. I propose to suspend this framework and instead concentrate on the concept of public memory and its relationship to visual culture. In his introduction to a volume entitled Framing Public Memory, Kendall Phillips stresses the rhetorical nature of memorial processes, and I quote from his text. The ways memories attain meaning compel others to accept them, and are themselves contested, subverted, and supplemented by other memories. Today, this rhetoric can, and even predominantly is, visual. Public memories both constitute our sense of collectivity and are constituted by our togetherness. And as such are, Phillips argues, very much orchestrated by the affective forces aimed to achieve specific result, form of the commons. Public memory, and I write this after Edward Casey, unlike collective or social memory, is one which exists, and I quote, in the open, in front of and with others, end of quote. It is an object of negotiation, interaction, and dispute. It is less an object of study than a matter of everyday life and struggle, which besides the so-called ordinary people, that is citizens, engages also artists and academics, also as citizens. All of the subjects and subject positions can partake in creating a public. And if public memory becomes an arena for collective action or acting, it is a creative space per se, or rather the space of the creative. In pursuing this line of thinking about public memory, we tend to concentrate more on the forms in which it emerges and takes place rather than on its contents. Phillips suggests that we should look at public memory as the memory of publics, which rests on the acknowledgement that many individuals remember the same thing. It is remembrance together as a crucial aspect of our togetherness, our existence as a public. The memory of publics is mobilized by remembrance, forgetting, authority, resistance, responsibility, absolution. There exists, however, another aspect of public memory, what Phillips calls the publicness of memory, which is in turn mobilized by appearance, loss, repetition, mutation, hegemony, and stability. These are not separated, but rather they intermingle and are mutually dependent. If one wishes to consider public memory in one frame, one needs to be aware of the complexities and problems induced by the other. An interesting contribution to the discussion of the role of images in shaping public memory can be found in Barbie Zelizer's reflection on what she calls subjective voice of images in public memory. That is a conviction that images might give birth to possibilities, reinterpretations, and uncertainties of events from the past. There is more to images in memory than just their indicative or symbolic capacity. Zelizer rightly argues. She pays attention to recurring visual tropes in formations of public memory, tropes which travel over temporalities and topographies, activating potential analogies in historical experience and between historical protagonists. It might be contended that the rule governing the function and dynamic of images in public memory is that of montage, that is, images act through contingency. And I quote from Zelizer, their meaning settles not on the image's original point of display, but over time in new contexts that are always altered, sometimes playful and often contradictory. By playing to the contingent aspect of a depicted event or issue, the image's capacity to speak for the past changes in its relation to the events it depicts. And when dealing with events of tragic nature, contingency may be the best interpretative stance for which we can hope. End of quote. This openness of public memory, its being in front of and with others, that's a quote from Edwards, allows us to think about it as an agonistic space, where through visual means, the past and the present alike are being objects of an affectively charged struggle of various, at times even clashing interests and claims. Today, when I'm speaking to you, refugees and migrants catastrophe on Polish-Belarusian border and the picturesque yet lethal primeval forests escalates undocumented, or at least partially undocumented, as Polish authorities introduce state of exception in the border zone. Yet, we see some images leaked by activists documenting their struggle and documenting the operations of those in power to push back and kill. We also see artists responding immediately and providing the public with what I would call protesting images. Golden foil flags used in a demo on October 17th in Warsaw, made of the like of emergency blankets, NRC foil, or the so-called live foil, by artist Jan Narykowska. You can see this image on the left, actually taken by me during the demonstration. Or the leaflet designed by another artist, Wilhelm Sasnal. And the leaflet you can see on the right, saying, and I translated from the leaflet, we shall never accept the violation of human rights based on skin color or lack of EU passport. I decided to include these images here, as at the last stage of my project, I have concentrated specifically on the agency of artistic operations and interventions. I wanted to grasp the complexity of backward looking, which is always at the same time responding to the pressures of the present moment. What comes to us as memories, or better said, after images, the images of what was, are always inherently transitory and receding. Upon looking closer at the mutability of memories and the dynamics of their resurfacing, one realizes the complexities of the underlying struggles of various groups to maintain or resist troubled past and traumas, which respond to the hegemonic attempts at fixing memories, be it in the stone monuments or in immutable sequences of images and powerful narratives, and ask how the past can be opened up and its debilitating legacies transformed. It's a question asked by Marianne Hirsch, a scholar of memory, in her book, in collected volume entitled Women Mobilizing Memory. So how the past can be opened up and its debilitating legacies transformed by creative tactics, disrupting and engaging at the same time. What role do the arts play in combating the erasure of past violence from current memory and in framing current violence in order to make sense of it, render it historical, but also opposable? We find ourselves in the need to redefine, and again, I quote from Hirsch, the linear temporality in favor of lateral, contingent, non-genealogical forms of transmission that can also inform our thinking about memory and its conception of the past, the present, and the future. Something, as Hirsch rightly points out, queer theories have pointed out for a while already. So why do artists return, or do they? Artistic interventions in the realm of our public visual memory transport us back to the past, let us recollect the images and feelings, and at the same time, they anchor us powerfully in the present, alarming us not so much to remember as to see and perform the imaginative work of association and affective montage. I'm showing you two very different works of this kind, in my opinion. One is Zbigniew Libera's Legal concentration camp from 1995, and the other one is Jasmila Żbanic's Quo Vadis Aida, a film from 2020, which narrates the history of genocide in Srebrenica, actually history of one women's struggle. The first, emerging in the aftermath of the so-called war in the Balkans and the disintegration of the state of Yugoslavia in 1995, with genocide in Srebrenica and Omarska concentration camp run by Bosnian Serb forces. The latter shot after the so-called migrant crisis in the Balkans in 2015, when up to 3,000 refugees, mainly from countries in the Middle East, but also from Albania and Kosovo, daily set on the so-called Balkan route. To hold on to this connection between Poland and Bosnia, World War II and the Balkan Wars, let us have a look at two photographic works investigating the landscape of past and present violence, the violence of destruction and the violence of erasure. Makeshift, the project on the top, as a project by photographer Paweł Starzec, Polish photographer, focusing on mass atrocities of Bosnian war, places where they were committed and they erased context. In most cases, sites used to keep, torture, rape, and murder civilians were renovated after the war and thus restored to their former purpose of buildings of public utility. No commemorations added. The artist documents the invisible with no personal relation to this history, with an urge to see. He executes what Nicholas Mirtsev called the right to look. And so does Wojciech Wilczek on the bottom of the slide, who has documented the buildings of synagogues and Jewish prayer houses, their transformations, their remnants, and thus he grasped the dynamic of erasure, disappearance, and collective blindness, but also helplessness in the face of the traces of Jewish life in Poland, contemporary traces. Both photographers, like many other artists discussed in the RePAST project, teach us how to look and specifically how to see the landscape. They record what is out of view and thus enable future processes of unlearning innocence and accommodating implicatedness as a subject position for those who come after the fact of violence and live in the vicinity of its traces and remnants. This very important mode of unlearning the structures of dominance in public memory and in space is part of the decolonial struggle, both activistic, artistic, and academic. Some histories need to be put along one another, some set against different frameworks, which can open new possibilities for connectedness and new genres of interpretation. Acknowledging the privilege of whites, even in seemingly racially homogeneous societies, and acknowledging racism, a structural problem, condition, and narrative framework, allows to readdress past and present violence. Oops, sorry. What you're looking at are works placing Black bodies in the landscape of racist language and imagery. First, a photograph taken by Rafał Milak during Black Lives Matter solidarity protests in Warsaw last year after the killing of George Floyd. And second, the painting by Wilhelm Sasnal included in his ongoing show, a huge show, entitled Such a Landscape at the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. Sasnal revisits the famous 1934 poem every Polish kid, at least Polish kid of my generation, knows by heart, and the racist phantasm of a little Black kid and white fantasy of civilizing the savage. A phantasm the artist himself fought facing, and I'm kind of I know it from the artist himself. I'm putting this painting now in context of the whole exhibition. To show how a theater of display can trigger a particular affective response. The walls of the museum have been covered with thin foil, which works as a distorted mirror. Once we keep the right distance from the paintings, we can see our reflection. On approaching them, the reflection becomes more and more blurred, as if we should look for the reflection in the paintings themselves. Sasnal offers an interesting constellation of issues, or rather elements of the troubled landscape, and implicates his viewers. Holding on to the racially motivated persecution and art, that speaks in an equally powerful way to past and present, I would like to share with you a story of a Romani sculptress, Małgorzata Mirgatas, who designed and carved in wood the monument to the Roma people killed by Nazi and Polish policemen in 1942, thus commemorating the Romani Holocaust in the region where she was born and lives. 4 years after the mounting of this monument that you see at the bottom of the slide, unknown perpetrators destroyed the construction. For the artist, the violence done to her sculptures was a reenactment of the historical violence done to her people. So Mirgatas recreated the monument, but also created the sculptural series consisting of the wax molds of the remains of the first monument, thus commemorating the fact of ongoing destruction and racist anti-Roma violence. What I find especially powerful is that she refused to put the figures back into a hole, but rather exposed the very brutal act of dismembering, which she has casted in pink wax. When thinking about her work, and there's a very important recent development, Małgorzata Mirgatas, Polish Romani artist, is going to represent Poland at next Venice Biennial in Polish Pavilion. So you can see some of her works on this slide, but also 2 issues of the journal I'm editing, View Theories and Practices of Visual Culture, that we devoted to images and imageries of race and racism in the context of not necessarily racialized countries such as Poland or other Middle and Central Eastern countries, where, as I said, the structures of racism are dominant, and there are also structures of the knowledge formation and memory formation as well. When thinking about the work of Mirgatas and works by many other female artists analyzed in RePAST, I'm reminded that art operates in relation to memory in different scales and formats, from modest acts of repair to greater gestures and projects. The first ones are what Mikebal called small-scale resistances, and they offer what Yves Kosowski-Sedgwick called middle ranges of political and historical agency. However small, subtle, and unspectacular, still they become disturbances which render history incomplete and open it up not as that what was, and I'm following Gabriela Zolai here, but what might have been, the unrealized possibilities, eventualities that resonate across time and space. We live in the vulnerable times, as Marianne Hirsch has recently suggested. Yet our vulnerability should not be treated as an excuse for passivity, but rather as a matter of resistance towards, and I quote from Hirsch, the unforgiving temporality of trauma and catastrophe, the sense of inexorable repetition of the past in the present and future, in which injury cannot be healed or repaired, but lives on, shattering the worlds in its wake, end of quote. Crucial question, which I rephrase after Hirsch, is thus how the retrospective glance might be expanded and redirected to open these alternate temporalities that might be more porous and future-oriented, and that also might galvanize a sense of urgency about the need for change now in our contemporary moment. So let me now talk briefly about a couple of art projects authored by women artists. Ever since installing her nomadic monument to 8,372 victims of the Srebrenica genocide, for the first time in 2006 in Sarajevo, Bosnian artist Aida Sehovic has been organizing an annual installation of this monument in different parts of the world, including Switzerland, Turkey, Canada, and others, in collaboration with Bosnian diaspora communities. And that's the picture in the middle. It has been collectively assembled and disassembled by people, not only those closely related to the genocide, but those who felt emotionally or ethically interpellated to participate. Thus, each year, small porcelain cups are filled with black coffee on 11th of July, and the title question, "Što te nema?" Why are you not here?, inclusively asks for commemoration of these and other victims, for resistance against the genocidal politics, and for a form of togetherness that is not state-orchestrated. In her Illegal 2015 embroidery series, another Bosnian artist, Adela Jusic, narrates the history of women in resistance and underground movement, pointing to the private and intimate spaces traditionally associated with women's sociality as occasions for subversive action, formulating and transferring political messages and memories, thus opposing patriarchal customs, traditions, power, and violence. And those were the images on the right. And now the images, the two black and white photographs on the left, authored by Lala Meredith Fula. Who photographs life in Kosovo's rural landscapes, including the blood-feud reconciliation movement, which began with students and human rights activists imprisoned for protesting Yugoslav abuses against Kosovo Albanians. Some of the photographs in the series were found very powerful by the critics, as they managed to catch a moment of people coming together to witness the reconciliation, a fugitive moment of common desire for change, and a collective feeling of hope. Also, as the artist herself stated, there was a feeling of history being made and of everyone sharing that great moment. In her Weeds from 2015, a project by Polish artist Karina Giovnovic, she transports a piece of a meadow from one of the villages in southwestern Poland that were subjected to ethnic cleansing after the Second World War. The plants act as a unique record of social and political history as they grow in deserted places that were formerly densely populated. 80 years after their inhabitants were forced to leave or killed, the plants are the only reminder of their presence and violence that put an end to it. As you can probably realize, there are no monuments. Diana Lelonek, in her project A New Archaeology for Liban and Płaszów from 2017, revisits and examines closely the abundance of natural and man-made traces of the Liban quarry and the former Płaszów concentration camp, both in Kraków. She studies the processes that take place underground and what they possibly reveal about the past as well as the present uses and abuses of these sites. And lastly, Rhizopolis from 2020 by Joanna Rajkowska, the same who did the golden flags for the demonstration a couple of weeks ago. Her Rhizopolis, which stresses the interconnectedness and dependence of human and natural history of destruction, at the same time addressing the climate catastrophe, which follows detachment and violence done to nature. So critical memory art makes us realize that alternatives are needed not so much to forgetting as to remembering. And this is the last project that I want to share with you, a project commissioned by the Jewish Museum in Berlin by Israeli artist Yael Bartana, entitled Malka Germania, Malka Germania, I think. Malka Germania in Hebrew and Aramaic is Queen Germany. But when you look at Yael Bartana's work, it's definitely also queer Germany. A combination of the Hebrew name and the title of the Nazi vision of the city of Berlin as Germania, or Germania. A weird combination, one must admit. Israeli artist Yael Bartana, in her video installation, commissioned by the Jewish Museum in Berlin, like previously in her And Europe Would Be Stand, the so-called Polish trilogy, and the framework of the Jewish Renaissance movement to Poland, offers a polyphonic visual fantasy that plays with all kinds of associations and expectations one might have about the critical memory work along the Jewish-German line. Bartana offers a provocative epiphany of the she-messiah on her donkey, accompanied by soldiers of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, the Orthodox Jews renaming the streets of Berlin, androgynous dancers and German refugees meeting in the forest. The past and future collapse into what has been called by one of the critics a retrospective present, where everything seems possible, yet nothing is for real, although at the same time, everything has already been. In her essay published in the catalog of Yael Bartana's project, Griselda Pollock, whom I quoted at the beginning of this talk, asks, and I think it's a very important question, can art working perform for us an analysis of consciousness that can balance imaginative, aesthetically fashioned fiction with a historical urgency that reframes the past, remembered in art's forms and transformed to incite political action on behalf of the realization of not yet imaginable future. End of quote. Facing the challenge to answer Pollock, I would say it cannot perform much without us giving into it. Artistic interventions into the structures of feeling and remembering allow for uncovering and affirmation of that which has been absent, forgotten, diminished, discriminated, downplayed, silenced, never imagined, found unworthy of public recognition, or repressed from public memory. It is memory work, political action, and a statement on the condition of arts and culture at the same time. As many critics have already pointed out, the insights of artists and forms of their engagement, as well as their responses, demand more from critics and scholars than they have already received. One of the aims of this project I was involved in is to overcome the apparent isolation of arts and cultural practices from the actual social and political life and prove that arts play a crucial role among complex, oftentimes competing narratives about past conflicts and violence. Thank you. And I would be very interested to hear your comments or questions or just thoughts if you're willing to share.
I have one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's about the memories, because Poland, you know, there is a new politics, which is not very democratic. And memories can be used as an emotional blackmail to continue the power. And art is an open space to free yourself from the traumas which can be used by the politics as emotional blackmail. So what happened when there's the conflict? It's no conflict, it's the politics, people who are in politics, and the artists.
Of course there is.
Oh, okay.
And I believe not only in Poland, I mean,
no, it's everywhere, also in the Netherlands. So.
Yeah, well, in that sense, I would say that you need that conflict in order for artists to be really productive. I mean, they have to go against the officials or against the power, and they need to speak to the
artists are happy with the conflicts.
So on the one hand, obviously you have artists who accompany those politics of memory by means of, you know, putting monuments, designing spaces of commemoration and so forth and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, I would say that majority of artists, and I was showing you majority of artists I was showing you were Polish actually, but we have an immense collection of artistic projects from other countries such as Spain, for example, or Ireland, where you can see how you're not so much questioning forgetting about certain, you know, events from the past or certain subjects from the past, but you're questioning as an artist in your artistic project, current politics of memory. You know, what memories are there out in the public for us to, you know, to acknowledge and to perform. So there has to be a conflict in a sense, I would say. If there was no conflict, there would be, you know, we'll be bound to fail. Yeah.
I would be, thanks very much for the presentation and the examples. I would be interested in the problem, we've spoken about that a little bit before, in the problem of the literacy to read art or to understand art, because I get the point of kind of mainstreaming art into politics and other disciplines, and we all believe in that somehow, but we all also experience that there's a fundamental gap in reading a visual language or a performative language. And without walking into the trap of being instrumentalized as an artist to solve problems which we're not there for. So how would you, did the project address the problem of the literacy, so to speak, of the non-artist?
Mm-hmm. It's a very, thank you for this question. It's very complicated because on the one hand, of course, I mean, I think, again, this can be said about majority of countries that we suffer from lack of proper education at schools for kids, and then for people, for citizens to be visually literate, to be able to read visual, and not only arts, but any visual message, you know, photography, press photography, online visuals, all of this, to be able to put these together or to, you know, to understand montage. So this is one thing. But the other thing is that I would say in relation to art, a certain misunderstanding can be very productive. The fact that you do not immediately understand what's going on and that you're lost, and it's a process when you actually work on finding out what is this particular work or artistic intervention about, and it plays with your emotions as much as it plays, or your body, and as much as it plays with your mind, with your thoughts and knowledge, is necessary. So I would say that it wouldn't be, I don't think it would be great if we understood art like 100% and we had a toolbox to be able to dismantle all the messages and understand it, and nothing would be surprising in that sense, because but of course, I mean, there's always a danger that there's too much of misunderstanding, or that there's no understanding whatsoever, and art projects are just rejected for the fact that it's absolutely nonsensical. So it's very complicated, and I think it's multi-layered in that sense that and it's impossible to solve also, because for sure education is needed, school education, but also probably later in life, and that's something I can see museums doing and art institutions doing with their educational projects, public projects, and it's fantastic. But on the other hand, there has to be this margin where you're actually missing the message, and you have to get back to it. It has to be troubling for you. It has to trigger this kind of curiosity. So yeah.
No, but I think that art itself makes it already in your examples. You can also say that's already quite a big difference between artists who are maybe illustrating or showing the public, which is also very useful and important, or people like Yael who really transforms and transcends in that the problematics into completely new narratives, which which then start to tap in complete new layers that I'm very curious about. So, would you acknowledge the difference between these different arts that you're showing, that between basically illustrating or transcending?
Well, I would say that these works, and what I also find, because I told you at the beginning that I worked on this for 3.5 years, but this was this particular project. But for example, with the Libera's work, like a concentration camp, I've been looking at this work for so many years. I wrote my paper when I was an MA student back in 2003, I think, and it was a completely different work of art for me. And only with time, it gained more and more meaning and resonances. Ever interested in those illustrative strategies, as I wasn't interested in those purely commemorative strategies. Although with the Bosnian project of this nomadic monument,
I would classify that as primarily showing the problem, and not so much making it new message.
Yeah, but weren't they new?
Sorry?
Weren't these projects new forms of approaching the problem?
Maybe not from a perspective of the art world. It was very
artistically new. Okay, in a sense.
It was more like making a drawing of what happened, basically. I mean, that's not bad. It's very good and very useful. It was art or other works that you've shown there is much more this elaboration or taking it into a new weird zone, like with Paranoia, right?
Problem at our disposal when discussing those kinds of works of art, and
well, it it's work.
Okay.
That's what I would say. But if you want to understand what's going on as a layman, I think it'd be good to be aware that there's also very different strategies with different artists to do.
Well, even though there's of course different artists from different countries even, but sort of would be interested to know also, is there some sort of political movement, or is that or is it very different? You talk about memory, or memory is a very sort of important subject. But for instance, in a political context, or
Again, a very important question and difficult one, because I don't think any of these works goes beyond the political. They're all very political, and as I said at some point in this presentation, I do think that if we kind of shift our perspective a little bit and think about artists as kind of predominantly political subjects, as citizens, as people who are kind of doing work, not only in the field of aesthetics, let's say, but also in the field of politics. And in the field, hence, my idea to shift that, thinking from cultural memory to public memory, that by doing these works, they're trying to make an intervention, not so much in an artistic not only in artistic or aesthetic realm, but also in the kind of political realm, in the politics of memory. But of course, again, their position is weaker and stronger, one could say at the same time. It's weaker because they don't, operate on the kind of simple, direct message, code, right? But they operate on metaphor. They operate on language that has to be decoded, and they operate on emotions, but not in the way, traditional politicians do. So it's a different rhetoric. And, the question that Lars asked, do we know how to communicate with arts? No, we don't, not fully. So is their message, working? Are these strategies really working? And I would say yes and no. So they are working for some, and they might be working for others, as long as these works are out there in public and kind of they're shown over and over again. They're put in different constellations, in collected, in group exhibitions. They're exhibited individually, and as I said, there's a work for critics and academics to make, because if these projects are in conversation by means of other people working about them, discussing them in public, like here, and I'm really grateful for that opportunity. There's still kind of their political potential is out there. But also, since you brought that up, Yael Bartana, when she did that video trilogy entitled "And Europe Will Be Stunned," with the 3 works, The Nightmares, The Wall and Tower, and and I forgot the third title, sorry, which was again a fantasy, a historical fantasy about a Polish political leader calling on 3,300,000 Jewish people to come back to Poland. And so she envisioned this return, and she set up something called the Jewish Renaissance Movement to Poland, which was a kind of political party, although it wasn't a party. But wasn't it a party if it was there? There was a congress in Berlin that had people coming into this congress, and I read numerous interviews with the artist when she was asked, but is it for real or is it just art? And she would say, it is for real because it is art. I mean, what's the difference? People are coming and we are discussing. The question of return is very important, both for Polish memory context, as it is for Israeli-Palestinian, memory context, as it is for American Jewish memory context. So, was it political action? She didn't become a member of parliament in any of the states, but she refuses to, belong to any of the states. She lives between the Netherlands and Germany, and she's the citizen of Israel, right? So her politics operates in a different kind of realm, but also plays with the very idea that, is it for real or is it just an artistic intervention? And she's like, yeah.
You make this distinction between cultural memory and public memory. But I'm still a little bit puzzled by the distinction. But is it that public memory is dialogical and cultural memory is kind of homogeneous realm, or how do the artistic interventions relate to cultural memory and to public memory?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, I would say that one does not exclude the other. It's just a shift in perspective rather than a shift in vocabulary. So we keep both. But when you read about cultural memory, it's most of the time discussed as something that has its canon, as something that is kind of long term. Whereas I would say public memory is about publics, about us being now here and now, experiencing this particular political situation, be it locally or globally, and artists intervening with their works about the past into this particular situation. So public memory, I would say, is much more about the present that cultural memory is. And also I would stress that, you know, to keep the public memory framework, because it does not separate artists from other actors in the kind of in the memory field. So it's not cultural memory that is done by means of, you know, writing literature, you know, poetry and so on and so forth. And there's other memory field, which is then, you know, designed by politicians and officials and activists. No, it's one. So that's my, that's why I'm trying to stress this shift, but, you know, obviously keeping both.
No, but I think it's important to make this distinction, because the way you talk about it, it seems that cultural memory is passed on from the past to the present, and in a way, in public memory, that cultural memory is contested. Yeah.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah, also it's a bit confusing because everything in this realm, of course, is cultural. You narrow down the meaning of cultural as a more artistic or elitist part of the culture. Maybe it's more specific.
I was more relating to, you know, cultural memory as it's discussed by scholars of memory studies. So that's a kind of, you know, it's a memory formed by cultural artifacts. You know, that kind of, there's an archive there, and there's a canon that is activated from the archive for one particular generation, maybe, you know, in that sense. Yes.
My question is related to one particular project for Bosnia, which is a project. And as you said, it started in 2006 in Sarajevo. What struck me, while I believe that this is one of the best ways of commemorating the victims of Srebrenica, because it creates a very lively and literally fluid kind of memorial, which is transported from one city to another. But it struck me that it was not until last year when the project went to Srebrenica. So I was aware, as we know, there is a commemoration every year on July 11th. There is burial, there is a huge official ceremony. And, I was wondering whether you know the reason why it just started out in different cities with the diaspora and so on, and then returned to where it makes most significance at the place where the murders were committed. So I'm wondering whether it has to do with the way we interpret these artistic commemorations, or our capability of understanding them, or it is because of the conflicting memory space in Bosnia between the official commemorations and the alternative commemorations. So what would be your
I don't know the exact reasons. The thing I know is that Sahovic herself is a member of diaspora. She does not live in Bosnia. So for her, I understand. I mean, so the way I understand it is it was a way to address her community in a way, right? The community of her likes, people who have no, even if there was a monument, you know, a place where you can go and you know, mourn the victims or remember the victims. You can't go there because you're not on site. So I really like the idea of placing in a different, making it nomadic. I really like this idea because it's something that it goes counter the idea of monument itself. Monument is on site. But what I also think she was trying to do is to open up this space for, as I said, for all other, or maybe some other, you know, victims. If you want to join in, you, by mourning these particular victims of this cleansing in Srebrenica, you might also come with your own. You know, everyone's invited in a way. And, you know, again, the artistic now level of this very simple work, it's coffee, it's black, right? It's in tiny filigrane, and there's a group of women who kind of initiate it every now and then. And and then people come in and join in by kind of making coffee and drinking it together. So it takes time to actually create this community. And you don't have to, they're not discussing the thing, right? They're just there, but coffee is black, you know, like morning, like in this very, and it's women who wait. I mean, you know, from ancient literature, right? Who sit and wait, and they ask the same question: why are you not here? And of course, there's no answer to this question. There's just this ritual of annual yeah, again, so it goes against every possible framework we can think of in the Western canon for a commemoration, for fixed memory, for something. There's if there is a monument out there, and of course we know from Musil that there's nothing is as invisible as a monument that is in place. And of course we know again from Young after 1980s and 1990s with the era of counter monuments, you know, that all of this has been deconstructed. And yet I think in her gesture, so maybe, you know, coming back home in a way with this monument, you needed time, needed these many other instances of, you know, of coming together to actually come to the right place. But also I can imagine that this is some possible trauma to actually to go to this place and to do something like this. Thank you. Do we have any questions from Zoom? Did people even knew that they?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for all the
You're
questions.
always like to stay for a glass of wine and ask all the questions you didn't dare to ask.